Okay, well, as you, hang on, let me just stop sharing my screen first. Great. Thank you everyone for joining. As you would have just heard, we are recording this webinar, which we'll then share on the ODI YouTube channel. So I'm Ellen, I work at the ODI as a community manager, mainly working on our innovation programs, which includes Data Pitch. So I've worked with Gethian before in the past, and I'm very looking forward to this talk about myth busting around data sharing. A bit of housekeeping, please do keep your cameras off and keep yourself on mute during the talk. If you have questions that you think of during the presentation, please just write them in the chat, and then once the presentation is over, I'll invite you to ask them, or I can ask them on your behalf if you prefer. So anything I have missed? Yeah, so those are the main things. So now I'll hand over to Gethian and start sharing your screen. Thanks.
All right, let me try this. Share. Here we are. Hopefully this works. So first of all, thanks for having me. As Ellen said, we've been working together on Data Pitch. And I'll go through just a little bit of what I will talk about. I'll start with just an overview of what data sharing is and why you should care to begin with. I'll talk about a little bit about Data Pitch, the project from which we have developed this toolkit for data sharing. And then I'll go into the meat of it, really, talking about how to share data and what the individual steps are you want to consider while you go through that process. There's a couple of case studies sprinkled in between to visualize what I'm talking about. I expect to be talking for about half an hour, so we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion afterward. So let me get started on data sharing. Given where we are, I very much hope I'm preaching to the choir with this slide on what data sharing is. So you have the obviously ODI data spectrum, moving from closed data to open data. Where I will be focusing today is on this element of shared data. Data is driving innovation, and machine learning, AI have increased the value of data in general. And while open data is great, not everything can or even should be open data. And with the open data that we have, there's a couple of issues, things like potential inconsistencies, potential limited quality. And the data that we've been looking at in Data Pitch is data that is shared by organizations, data that is high quality, but that cannot be made public. The only way to access this data is by having it shared, and that is what I will be talking about, how that worked and what we've learned from that. There are very many ways of sharing data in many different areas of openness. Obviously, you've got open data where it's just openly licensed and available to use. You have data commons where resources are made accessible to specific groups, or collaboratives where they're made available for social good. Data marketplaces where data is bought and sold through platforms. And again, given where we are, you have probably heard about data trusts as a framework to enable the ethical sharing or the trustworthy sharing of data. There are plenty benefits to why you would want to share data for different stakeholders. The way we structure this in the toolkit is between data holders, which are organizations that have data, innovators, which are organizations that use the data, that do something with it, intermediaries who sit in between these two, and society in general. In terms of benefits, I'm not going to talk through all of them, but I just want to highlight a few. For data holders, one of the key benefits is increases in efficiency and saving costs. So they use their data to make their own business more efficient, make their own process more efficient, save costs in the process. There's obviously product and service development, and this cuts across multiple of the stakeholders. So obviously If a data holder uses their data or shares their data to have it used, that can result in product and service development for the data holder. It can also result in product and service development for the innovators, depending on the setup of the individual data sharing relationship. There is some sort of development from this data, which then in turn benefits society at large because they have better products and services, or access to better products and services. In terms of intermediaries, data sharing is a marketable offer in itself. So enabling data sharing is a business model. It's already a current business model and it's growing. So there's a clear business benefit there. And then for society at large, obviously all of this is in one way or another creating jobs. Data Pitch has been an open innovation program centered on data innovation, as it is in the name. It was funded by the European Commission under H2020 with a consortium of 4 organizations from the UK, France, and Portugal. So you have the organizations at the bottom. DAWEX is a data marketplace from France. Better I is a accelerator in Portugal. The ODI, I hope I don't have to introduce. And at the time I was at the University of Southampton and we have coordinated this program. In Data Pitch, we ran 2 open calls with 3 different types of data challenges over the course of 3 years. And we supported 47 different data-driven startups with a slightly smaller number of data holders. So we had some data holders that were attached to Data Pitch directly. They shared their data through the program. For others, we had the startups bringing their own data with their own sharing agreement from different data holders. And the overall goal of Data Pitch was to create a European data innovation ecosystem that brought together organizations that have data with startups that have need of the data, fresh ideas for how to use that data, to do something with that data to generate value. It has been fairly successful. I'm not going to go through all of the numbers, but over the course of these 3 years, we covered 28 different data challenges. We worked directly with 17 data holders sharing their data through Data Pitch. The projects were across 14 different countries, 47 companies. We created nearly 100 jobs, and that is all status of last year. It will have improved by now. So much for background. Let me talk about how you actually do this thing. There's a couple of steps that are sequential, like defining the value proposition for why you want to share data, understanding the data, assessing and mitigating the risks related to that, and then establishing the legal terms. And then on the left here, what cuts across is resources that are needed for the entire process. So you have your teams and resources, which is essentially your human resources, your financial resources, and then you have to consider scale for the whole process. And these are the steps that I will talk you through now. If you want to share data, you want to start by defining the goals and outline exactly how everyone involved in the process is going to be involved, what their role is, what they do, and also what they want. I want to start by considering exactly why the data is shared. That is like the fundamental thing you need. What is it you want to achieve by sharing the data? And then obviously with whom? And you want these people to be qualified, to have the right skills and whatever it may be for the given circumstance. You want to think about how each of the stakeholders involved in this is benefiting from the process. Are you an organization that wants to share data to generate internal benefit? Then you probably want to think about some sort of financial model that anyone who uses the data or does something with it for you needs to be paid. If you want to generate value on a more general level, you might want to think about a setup where you share IP rights on the results. But you want to think about for each of the stakeholders involved why they would engage in this in the first place. You want to have some idea of how you ensure that the benefits that there can be are actually happening, and what each of the stakeholders needs to do for that to happen actually. So in theory, it may sound nice, but you have to have a way to actually make that real. If there are any external stakeholders, obviously, if you need, you know, potentially legal consultancy or anything of the sort, and then what terms of license will be needed to assure that these benefits actually end up with the party, which we'll come back to in a later slide. Apologies. Let me show you how this can work. One of the data holders we worked with in Data Pitch was Greiner Packaging International. That's a large German company, plenty manufacturing plants across the country, very interested in data-driven innovation to the degree that they have staff dedicated solely to making data-driven innovation happen. They joined Data Pitch with 3 different data sets, all from their manufacturing plant sensor data. And they had no clear idea of what they wanted. They had no specific goal in mind, but they wanted to explore what sort of thing can be done with that data. And they ended up with 5 different pilots recruited through Data Pitch that responded to that challenge, which ended up doing very different things, all of which obviously beneficial to Greiner. One of these startups worked on stock optimization, making sure that the manufacturing plants had the right levels of stock at any given moment in time. Another one looked at pattern recognition and digital twinning, making sure that the data was accurate. Or they looked into decision support, they looked into optimizing the data flows themselves. All of these 5 startups contributed something of value to what Greiner did, simultaneously developing their own products for their own benefit, which was the whole setup of Data Pitch. But what goes to show here is that you can share data even if you don't have a very specific view of exactly what you want to do, if your goal is exploration. The next thing you want to do is you want to understand the data, because the data that you have and the use you want to put it to need to be very well aligned. You need to know what you have, and you need to know what you need to achieve those goals. And the important bit here is that that requires a combination of expertise from very different areas, which I'll come back to when we talk about resources. But you need people who understand whether the intended outcomes are achievable at all. Like, there's plenty of assumptions about AI and what it can do, some of which sounds like magic, some of which is impossible. So you need a way to assess what is possible. And you need the expertise internally to tell that. You need to know what data will be needed and whether that data exists in the first place. You might have goals in mind that you don't have the data to match to. You need to understand what the data includes, including the metadata to the data. You need to understand the individual elements of the data because they determine what can be achieved. You need to ensure that you have access to both the metadata and the actual data, because if you want to share it, you need to be able to do that on a physical level, right? You need to have the access to the data to begin with. You can't share your neighbor's department's data. And then all of that, you need to have the authority to share that data as well, which is usually where senior level buy-in comes into the process. So you need, on a business level, the authority to say this data leaves the organization. Next up, you want to assess risks. There's 2 different broad areas where risks are relevant. One is legal and one is business. The legal very obviously starts with the question, is personal data being shared? You need to be compliant with GDPR and I can wax about that philosophically for days, but I'm not a lawyer, so I won't, but we have written about that extensively in Data Pitch, and the resources are available in the toolkit. You want to apply the principles from GDPR. That is data minimization, that is anonymization, pseudonymization. You want to think about whether you need a data protection impact assessment. That is, if you have sensitive personal data. Although, as a general rule, we would recommend just doing a DPIA in any case, because it is just simply good practice and it helps you work through what data you have and what the implications can be, even if you don't expect major fallouts being possible. On a business level, there's two considerations for loss of competitiveness, both of them. One is there a risk that you become less competitive as an organization by sharing data? Is there a risk, or what are the risks of this data being lost, of this data becoming available to people who shouldn't have access to it, which obviously you can mitigate, but you need to consider it. And the other half to that is, what is the risk to your competitiveness if you do not share this data, if you do not work with this data? Will you over time become less competitive because you just leave this data alone and not do anything with it? Is there potential gain that you're losing out on because you're not working with the data? All of this obviously needs input from legal experts, but also from business experts and business strategists to ensure that you cover all of the bases. All of that then needs to flow through a contract. You obviously need to say you've done all of your thinking, you've done all of your planning, you know what you have, you know what you want. All of these terms need to be set down in a data sharing agreement. These are very complex contracts depending on how complex your data sharing setup is, but I have never seen an easy one. But you want to think about, as a data holder, but also as if the data is being shared with you, who owns the intellectual property rights? Like, that is one of the key questions. If you work with the data, if you develop something from it, who owns that? What outcome is required to justify required resources? So you're putting in a lot of time, a lot of effort, potentially financial resources. What outcome do you need to achieve for that to be worthwhile? Which is, again, a business strategy question. What data do the users get access to, and for how long? How do you revoke that access? Do you share the data on a hard drive? Do you share it online? Do you share direct access? Do you share a copy? What exactly is included in that data? Which are the individual details? Which are the individual fields in your database that you are sharing? And for how long? Is that just for the duration of the contract? Is that you pass it over and that is it and they keep it? These are key terms you need to agree on. And then obviously how any disputes get resolved. In GDPR terms, you certainly want to think about who the data controller and processor is and how these responsibilities are shared. Let me visualize that with another shorter case study. SpazioDati is an Italian business intelligence company. They were a data provider, a data holder in Data Pitch. And they wanted to improve their business intelligence data. They were matched through the Data Pitch process with IPlytics, who are also specialized in business intelligence. And their proposal was to combine the data that they had, amalgamated with publicly available data, with SpazioDati's database, which they did. And ultimately, both of them gained a much improved database for their respective platforms. So this was essentially a collaboration more than a direct data sharing, because it went both ways. Let me move on to resources. The key in all of this is the people. You will need at least 3 different departments, 3 different sets of expertise involved in setting up a data sharing relationship. You need someone to cover the technical aspects. You need someone who is able to identify suitable data, to physically carry out the data sharing, to implement the sharing, but also to implement the results of it. Those will be your data scientists, your technical experts. You need expertise for legal questions. You need someone who can do a legal risk assessment, who knows GDPR, who knows how to handle data protection, but also someone who can take all of these things that I've talked about and amalgamate them into a contract that then reflects exactly what you have agreed and is implementable as well. And then you need business or strategic expertise. You need someone who can assess the business risk, both of doing it and not doing it. Someone who can analyze and understand the potential benefit of data sharing. And that is crucial because the potential benefit may well be fairly technical, and the business strategy people may not necessarily have the expertise to judge that, which is why through everything, these three departments, these three expertises need to link, need to work together. And what you do when you first set up a data sharing agreement, and potentially later on, but the first time is the most important one, you need to build awareness and knowledge in the organization. That is of data sharing and the value proposition attached to it. That is the technical, what is possible and why should you do it? You need to understand or generate understanding of the challenges or business problems that could be solved with data. This is what is the opportunity? And again, this is very much in between the technical and the business strategy, but it also includes law, because what could be done is very much a legal question in the end. And then you need to identify or generate the skill to identify suitable data sets for sharing, for achieving what you want to do with that data. You need to have the skills to have that legal assessment of whether and under which terms this data can be shared at all, which is very much the legal expertise. But the legal experts can't answer that on their own, because if you just go to a lawyer and say, I want to share this data, they will ask you why, and then they will say, go away, unless you have a strong case to say this is something we need to do, which needs, as I said earlier, senior level involvement. Just a quick note on financing. Obviously, the biggest cost in all of this will be the time of the people, of the experts that I just talked about. But there are also different financial considerations, as in how do you make money from sharing data? And there's multiple ways. You can share data and directly monetize it. You can essentially sell it through intermediaries on data marketplaces, or by selling licenses to the data directly. You can also benefit financially by generating new products and services on the basis of this data, which is again what Data Pitch did. The value was not in selling the data. Actually, selling the data in Data Pitch was a no-go. The whole point was to generate benefit by using the data to a shared goal between the startups and the data holders. So they created new services, new products. The services and products came to the benefit of the data holders, but the IP rested with the startups who developed these solutions, so that both sides benefited. Last but not least, scale. Data sharing is hard to scale. There's no two ways about it. The preparation, the checks, the negotiations, all of that requires a lot of resources. That makes it potentially expensive. But there's certain things you can weigh up. The more time you put into the preparation of a data sharing relationship, the lower you can keep the risk. If you forego thoroughness on preparation, you can do that, but you increase the risk of potential data breaches, for example. Similarly, there's the balance between streamlining and flexibility. You can scale by having a default contract, a default data sharing agreement that you just sign away with as many users as you want, but that will mean it will not be flexible in what the content of that is. If you want more flexibility, which could increase the potential value of whatever data you share, whatever the outcomes are, you can't streamline it. So you need to weigh these two things. This is very much an active field in research and in business at the moment, and there are new solutions being developed all the time and consistently. Data Pitch finished at the end of last year, and I'm pretty certain that by now there have been new ideas for how to handle this, especially in the space of data trusts. Scale does go well with scale. It's easier to do multiple data sharing agreements than it is to do one, because you have to do all of that base work, everything that I described about building the knowledge, building the skills. You have to do that whether you do it once or whether you do it 100 times. So the more data you have, the more reach you have, the more users you have, it will make it overall more worthwhile. Obviously, you need to have the resources to put into it to begin with. Lack of skills and expertise prevent development at that scale, but they can be developed and grow together. You can develop the skills to share data by sharing data, and iteratively it will become easier, and as the skills grow, as the internal expertise grow, as the understanding of the benefits of data sharing grows within an organization, the easier it will get. The more you do it, the easier it becomes. All of this and plenty more is included in the Data Sharing Toolkit, which is available both online under this link, and I'm sure we can share a link in the chat. You can also download it. We even have, you know, if I had given this in person, I would have brought a stack of really nice printed copies that unfortunately I can't share now, but they are available, and if you urgently want one, we can post one to you. And that is me. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you, Gethian. Yeah, just a reminder, if you have some questions, put them in the chat, and then I'll invite you to speak them, just so we avoid people talking over each other. So Irma, would you like to go first?
Hello, thank you. My name is Irma. I'm Indonesian and currently I'm studying in the UK. So my questions is about the data that I will work on in energy sector. Do you have like example from the energy sector that already have this kind of
none from the top of my head. I think we did have someone working in energy in the data pitch case studies, but as I said earlier, there are 47 of them.
Okay.
And I don't know, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay.
But all of the case studies, all of the data sharing relationships are on the data pitch website, which we can share, and I think that might be worthwhile for you to look into.
Okay, so what kind of what kind of sector are they? I mean, like retails, or I mean, most of them. Do you know, or you don't know?
Yes. Well, there are many different ones.
Okay.
So there is definitely retail. There is definitely industry. There is telecommunication. There is media. Let me just quickly look it up, because there's automotive, energy, telecoms, privacy, finance, transport, quite a lot in transport actually, healthcare. So there's those 17 companies I said earlier, I think they're across 15 different sectors. And
my second question is it always like the business to business relationship? Because you say that the one that wants to help is always like already have the team. It's not like, is it like business to business, or is it like that?
It was business to business, and the toolkit is very much sort of geared towards a business to business relationship, but it doesn't have to be. I guess it depends on your individual situation, right? If you want if you want to have data shared with you or share data as a private person, I would ask you what sort of data that is, what sort of benefit there is to be gained from doing that. It may not need such an extensive setup if you're doing research on the data or something. But even then, you will still need a data sharing agreement, and you will still need to think through the terms. So those will still be applicable, even if if you're not doing it for financial gain directly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Emma. Oscar, I think you were next in the chat with your question.
Thanks so much. Thanks for a really great presentation. I enjoyed it. I was just wondering if you've come across any methods that companies use, and I'm thinking of some sort of accounting method specifically, that they can come up with the value of their data to be able to add it to their balance sheet in some way.
Directly, no. I think the problem with that is that you cannot judge the value of the data unless you've gone through an assessment of the opportunity that data has, right? And also to whom. Like, the data might be worthless to you, but it might be what somebody else urgently needs to fill in a gap in their development, right? And there's not only the question of what is the data worth in theory, but how can you realize that value? If you can't do that yourself, and you need sort of external help for that, that's a different setup than if you can just use the data and run with it internally, right? So I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all solution for that. It always depends on the case. It always depends on the individual data set, and there's no way around really assessing that on a case-to-case basis. Yeah,
okay, no, great, thank you.
Thanks, Oscar. Brian, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Hi, Geffen, and yeah, thanks again for a really good talk. My question kind of comes from thinking about my previous employer. So it was for a large American insurance company, been around for a long time, coming on 100 years, and they would consider their data to be their competitive advantage over new starts in the industry. So do you have any examples of companies of that scale and size sharing their data, or how might you incentivize them?
That is a good question. I don't know of any examples directly in insurance, and I understand that might be complicated. One of the case studies we had in Data Pitch was hospitals. Was a hospital company that had, I think they shared data from 14 different hospitals, not medical records per se, but sort of case files in terms of how patients moved through their different services. And they used that to develop procedures to improve their process flows. So that was a fairly large company, a fairly large data set, a fairly sensitive data set at that, but it was shared, and it was shared successfully. So I'm not so certain about insurance, as I said, because we haven't got direct experience in that. But it always depends on what can be done with the data, which again comes back to what I said earlier about you need to make that assessment.
Yeah. Thank
and
you.
Very obviously, you need to trust whomever you share the data with, right? I mean, you wouldn't share that side of sort of sensitive business data with a competitor necessarily, unless there might be a benefit in exchanging data. But you want to ensure that wherever the data goes is safe, which comes back to the risk assessment and comes back to having the right terms in how the data is shared legally.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I did have another question that was largely addressed through your slides on risks and contracts, but just maybe if you could elaborate a little bit. You talked about having to establish what the need and what the use for that data is going to be. So once that is established, would the recipient be considered to be locked into that? So they wouldn't be free to use that data for a different purpose other than the contracted agreed purpose. Yeah.
That is exactly what it means. That is exactly why you need to define the purpose of the data sharing so precisely, because that is what goes into the contract. you share data, or well, in our cases, we did share data for very specific purposes with a very specific set of people. And there was, well, obviously the people could have taken the data and run with it and done something stupid. That would have been illegal, right? That would have been outside of the bounds of the contract. But that is exactly what the contract is for, is to define exactly what the company is, or what the sharing partner is allowed to do with that data and what they are not. And then obviously that doesn't prevent mischief. If someone wants to do bad things, I always say they will find a way, but you want to make it as clear as possible what is allowed, so that there are clear boundaries. And then on the other hand, you will obviously want to do some decent vetting on wherever the data goes, depending on how sensitive it is. Like in the case earlier with the insurance, you don't want just anyone to be able to access that data. You want to have a thorough process to understand exactly who these people are, to understand exactly what their intentions are, and you want to have that on paper, or in black and white at least.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Brian. Next, there's a question from Adrian.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Geffen, for a very informative presentation. I really enjoyed that. Just on one of your earlier slides, you highlighted the benefits, and one of the benefits to society that you had was around improved privacy. Mm-hmm. And from some of my experience and some of the work that we would do, it's not always the public perception of data sharing that they will see an improved privacy element. I was wondering if you could just maybe elaborate a little bit on what you meant by that benefit, or the examples that you have of how that benefit was realized.
So let me give you an example. One of the companies we worked with was Altice as a data provider. They are, I think, Portuguese, big media company. They do like pay TV. And they worked with a startup that developed second screen scenarios. So you would watch something on TV and you would get a notification on your mobile to do something more with that content. Which, if you just hear it, sounds like it's a breach of privacy, but it was all based on consent. It was, and on a very thorough consent process, on a very, so this startup was very dedicated to not abusing trust, to actually increasing trust by having very active consent management. Which in turn meant that your data wouldn't be shared, like your personal data wouldn't be passed on to anybody if you didn't opt in for that. But if you did, you had very clear controls about what happened with that data. We also had, and I don't actually know from the top of my head where that one went, unfortunately, but there were applications developed within Data Pitch to increase privacy specifically, to anonymize data better, for example, to have better security on pseudonymized data. But the thing is, for all of that, you need the data to begin with. You need the data to work on, to establish methods that make it better, that make it more secure, that increase privacy ultimately. So I'm not saying every form of data sharing increases privacy. Every form of data sharing should be compliant with GDPR, especially as long as it's anywhere within Europe or concerning Europeans. But there are ways, there are effects of data sharing that can lead to increased privacy.
That's great, thanks. And if I may just ask one short question, apologies, that came to mind, was around the monetization of data, and an element of open data which would be so important in the future is around smart city type initiatives and citizen engagement. And have you seen examples, or did you have examples in the Data Pitch project where members of the public have the ability to monetize their own personalized data, whether that be wearable data, etc.? If not, it's fine, but just wondering if there were examples that you came across where the members of the public were engaged by monetizing their data.
Not within Data Pitch, I'm afraid. Not to my knowledge. as I said earlier, I don't know all of the 47 cases by heart, but I'm pretty certain we didn't have that specifically. But I know that such examples exist outside of Data Pitch. So I know that there are companies who make a business of managing personal data for citizens, who allow to share data very specifically with specific companies under specific terms and make a business out of that. So that is definitely something that is already out there in the market.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any final questions? Oh, yeah. Emma, do you want to go ahead and ask yours?
Hello, it's me again. Sorry. How does it take, for how long for the first defining the value until you establish like the website or the data sharing platform from your 4 steps?
From starting to actually sharing the data, I would say about a year.
A year.
Maybe 9 months if you're quick, 6, but it also very much depends on the size of the organization. Because in some organizations, some of the expertises that I said earlier and are required overlap. If you have someone who is a business expert and knows the legal side of things, that speeds things up because you have one less person to bring on board. On the other hand, if you have someone like Greiner with their dedicated staff for data-driven innovation, that also makes it a lot faster because you have the expertise with the internal network to enable to move quickly. On the other hand, if you don't have any of that and you have just, a single technician somewhere that would like to do this, who then needs to build the network to reach out to the right people to convince them, that will take a lot longer. So it very much depends on whom you're talking to.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any final questions? Yeah, Brian asked, if Data Pitch ended, what is next? A great question.
Well, I really ought to pass that one back to you, Ellen, wouldn't I? Because the Data Pitch startups are now all part of the ODI network.
Yes, they are. So there's some similar European Commission funded type accelerator programs that are still live. So the European Data Incubator is one to look at, which I think is currently open for applications. From an ODI perspective, we have a few more plans around running startup programs and expanding our kind of innovation work, but there's not anything I can publicly go into a lot of detail right now about, but I would keep an eye on our social media newsletters, things like that, to get the latest updates. Oh, there's one more question from Linus. Would you like to go ahead?
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you so much, Gefion, for providing this insightful presentation. I really enjoyed listening to you. I have a more sort of a general question on the impact this project has had on public organizations that were teamed up with these startups, especially with regard to the open data sharing culture. Is anything known on the effect on the public sector organizations? Because I'm coming myself from the public sector, and very often there is, there is some kind of, some kind of approach attached to working with the private sector, especially with sharing data with the private sector. If you could elaborate a bit more on this, it would be great. Thank you.
I can try. There wasn't actually that much public sector data holders involved in Data Pitch. I think the biggest one we had, might have been the only one, was the Met Office with a specific set of weather data. The problem with the public sector is that typically there is a much higher expectation for their data to be open. Therefore, there is no need for it to be shared in this concept, right? Because if it's open, you don't need most of what I've talked about. What the Met Office partners, don't know if it was 1 or 2, did, was they developed apps for, let me remember, fitness in relation to pollen data. So they developed an app that advised people with pollen allergies on when and how they could exercise, that sort of thing. How that has ended up at the moment, unfortunately, I am not aware of the details of. I only know what they did develop. I don't know how that has reflected back on the Met, but I do remember there being a large discussion about public sector data, because as I said earlier, because public sector data by and large has a higher expectation to be open, therefore there is less need for it to be shared. So if you have anything specific in mind, I would ask you to elaborate.
No, thank you so much. I just need a little bit of clarification on this. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Any final questions before we wrap up? No? Okay, well, thank you again, Gefion, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us and for your questions. I hope you found it useful and insightful. We are continuing to run these nearly every week, so do keep an eye out on the program, because we'd love to welcome you again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.